Dr. Exner-Pirot, in your paper, High Cost, Low Returns, you argue that Canada has the potential to become a global energy superpower. Could you expand on how the Liberal production cap completely undermines that goal, particularly in terms of our international competitiveness?
Yeah, it obviously makes, first of all, if most of the oil sands companies that are the higher emitters are publicly traded. And so they are competing for capital in global markets, and people can choose not only other oil and gas producers, but any other commodity or any other sector. So they have to fight a really good return on investment to get that money. Obviously, that's been very difficult in the last few years with the policies that we've had. And having an emissions cap on top of that tells investors, I don't know if I can grow. I don't know if I can produce more in the future. With this policy, I can't. I know that for sure. So no one wants to invest in capital-intensive operations without the promise of future growth. And so that has been, even though the cap has not yet been implemented, it has really been a downer on the ability to attract investment. Even with LNG, and everyone seems to like LNG nowadays, that still increases emissions, as was mentioned already this morning. And when you're trying to go to Asia and commit buyers, to offtake agreements and spend billions of dollars, they do ask the question, how does the emissions cap play into this? Will you be able to produce that LNG that I'm now committing billions of dollars to? Can I get that offtake? Will it be producing in 15 years? There is no good answer to that question with the emissions cap in place. But for the purpose of this committee, I just want to point out in the paper, I went through it with some economists. Canadian heavy oil, yes, is a higher emitting. It is on average, however, only now 1 to 3% higher emitting than the global average in archetype oil. So it is not exceptionally higher emitting anymore. I think that's a bit of a misnomer from 10 years ago. But the important thing for you to know is that it is less high emitting than other heavy oils. And you can't easily displace heavy oil with light oil. And so we aren't getting cleaner, Permian or Saudi to displace Canadian heavy oil. You'd be getting more Venezuelan and more Iraqi, and that has higher emissions. So on a global level, you will not reduce emissions by displacing Canadian heavy oil. You'll be creating a larger market for Venezuelan and Iraqi and Colombian in particular.
Thank you. The offset from those countries to me is a worrying proposition. The PBO estimated that the cap would cost the Canadian economy $20.5 billion by 2032, with an implied domestic carbon tax of $2,887 per ton. Can you point to any other country that's inflicting this sort of economic pain on itself?
Yeah, so in the paper, we just looked at exactly what the PBO said it would cost, and you divide that by how many tons the PBO estimate you save, and you come up with the cost for displacing every ton of carbon in Canada was $2,887. That's obviously far higher than the consumer carbon tax, which we kiboshed at $80 because we thought it was too high. So it seems a gross use of climate policy when there are so many lower hanging fruits, cheaper ways to do it. Norway's Evie subsidies are extremely high. The Inflation Reduction Act had some very high values. German move to wind and solar was extremely expensive. So there's a few comparators, but I didn't find that any was as high as the emissions cap.
Thank you, Doctor. So just as clearly as you can, if Prime Minister Carney moves ahead with this emissions cap, is there any chance we can become an energy superpower in your view?
Zero chance. In fact, we will see more economic decline, absolutely. And all those LNG terminals that just got approved on BC's west coast will probably not get a final investment decision, will not move to construction.
Now, in the event that somehow we could actually find new ways to get our product to market without repealing Bill C-48, could we become an energy superpower?
We have the world's, for democracy, Saudi Arabia has good reserves, Iran does, Venezuela. We are the only democracy with those exquisite reserves of well over 100. So I know that, there's a sense that we are moving away from fossil fuels. It hasn't happened yet. I hope we do, in sense, move away from it. But you have to appreciate that even when we're about 105 million barrels a day today. Even when you get to 80 or 70 or 60, you don't want all of that being provided by OPEC. You would want some democracies providing some of that oil as well, some proportion of it. And it will be Canada. The United States is obviously peaking at shale. Norway will probably have peak oil and gas production this year. The only big democracy provider that is going to be left standing will be Canada, because we have those enormous oil sands reserves. And in the Montney, we also have tremendous natural gas reserves. We won't run out here at home, but it's going to be very important for our allies that we're able to provide them with that secure supply.
Thank you. Now, obviously, the
Time is up.
6 minutes.
Oh, sorry, I have 1 more minute. Sorry about that.
Oh, and a few extra seconds now. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, Prime Minister Carney has obviously set up the Major Projects Office, and we're seeing, I assume, a bunch of lobbying behind closed doors to get their special projects selected. From a free market perspective, wouldn't it have made more sense to simply fix the environmental assessment process that was broken by Bill C-69 and allow the private sector to do what it does best rather than politicize this whole process?
So everyone is very pleased that at least there's been a focus on major projects and on building. So that rhetoric is welcome. Don Farrell is welcome. But I would say yes, from the private sector perspective, it wasn't another layer of government bureaucracy that they're looking to. It was to rationalize all of the environmental legislation that C5 tried to work around. And the joke is the workaround only works when you're around. But we could unleash, dozens or hundreds of projects instead of just the 5 and the 10 kind of being sprinkled in here and there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Dr. Exner-Pirot. When we're talking about emissions, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about this pivot that we've seen into green hydrogen. So the German Chancellor visited in 2022. He actually was right in my riding in Newfoundland and Labrador. He sought LNG, but was told that there was no business case leading to this pivot. I'm just curious where these current hydrogen projects stand, and also how Canada's decision to prioritize green hydrogen over LNG affect our credibility as a reliable energy partner.
Yeah, good question. So it was obviously infamous. German Chancellor and Vice Chancellor came in the middle of their own energy crisis as they were building their own LNG import terminals and trying to find alternative supply to the Russians, but also alternative supply to some of their Middle Eastern providers. They wanted some redundancy in supply and not all be dependent on the United States either. And of course, Canada has the resources of an energy superpower, but was not able to offer anything to our German colleagues at that time. And so there wasn't much of a business case, and promised instead green hydrogen. And actually that green hydrogen was supposed to be delivered in 2025. The MOU, that commitment with Chancellor Scholz, said that we'd be delivering in 2025. Obviously, we're nowhere near production. The bottom has fallen out of that market. There are not buyers in Germany. In fact, there's cheaper sources that they could be buying green hydrogen from in and around Europe. And so we have not seen that, which goes to the heart of where should we be putting our efforts, where should we be positioning our communities to thrive in the future, and think about doing things that have real investment, real capital, instead of focusing on hopes of some technologies coming out in the future.
And just further to that, what risks come with over prioritizing a technology that may not yet be market ready? What risks come to our energy sector?
Well, part of it was just the outlay of Canadian taxpayer dollars into something that didn't get a return on investment. Part of it is also the opportunity cost, though, and I think people need to appreciate when you're putting all your human capital and financial capital and political capital into untested technologies. That means that you're not focusing on building economies and businesses and firms and entrepreneurs on the other side of the ledger that might have a bit more sustainability. And of course, Newfoundland has tremendous oil and gas reserves, and that should be a bigger boom for the province than it is. But obviously the emissions cap has hampered Newfoundland maybe the most because we already have production in Alberta and Saskatchewan and BC. And so it's really growing the new production, investing in new fields that is the most unattractive with the emissions cap. And that means that the new developments, the new fields in Newfoundland and Atlantic offshore are the last ones that will get funding in this environment.
I also, just under that vein of, governments kind of picking the pivot to green hydrogen. Now we see Bill C5, as you've talked about, the government having the ability to pick winners and losers under this legislation. How might this deter other projects from moving forward or really growing an investment in that sort of an environment where the government has the opportunity to pick winners and losers?
So the main thing is that all the things that the C5 will allow, a handful of projects to get away from some of the bad legislation, regulatory framework, still exists for everybody else. Everyone is still operating with those bad regulatory frameworks that hamper investment. So that's the one thing. They still have the same system that we've had to deal with 10 years that hasn't produced good results. Then you also have competition, so that if a particular copper mine or uranium mine or project gets picked on the major projects office list, what about their competitor that is seeking same capital from the same sources, but isn't on this fast track list? That doesn't seem to be very fair for anybody. Again, the strategy should not be choosing 5 or 10 that the government thinks will be successful. The government should be setting a framework, an environmental landscape that attracts dozens, hundreds even, of projects to want to come to Canada and put their money to our economy.
Lastly, specifically, you mentioned our oil and gas offshore sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. What I hear, of course, is that once Beta Nord project is up and running, then that is sort of squeezing out any future investment. Could you just briefly speak to that?
Well, I hadn't.
Time is up. You'll maybe be able to respond that response in another question. Thank you.